Democrats, since they took the majority, has been addicted to spending, and that's going to stop.
We also have obligations to seniors who count on Social Security, our military that expects pay.
I'm running for president of the United States of America.
Hello, I'm Caitlin Huey-Burns in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are meeting about the debt ceiling right now at the White House, and we'll have more on that in a moment. But first, the 2024 Republican presidential field is growing. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott kicked off his campaign in his home state of South Carolina earlier today, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to jump into the race as soon as Wednesday. Meanwhile, time is running out for Washington to resolve the debt ceiling standoff. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen reaffirmed in a letter to Congress today that the U.S. could default as soon as June 1st. President Biden and McCarthy are having this meeting now, less than 2 weeks before that deadline. So for more on this, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Nicole Killian. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent joining us from the North Lawn, and Nicole is CBS News congressional correspondent joining us from Capitol Hill. Ed, I'm going to start with you because we just heard from the president and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy as they sat down for this meeting this evening. We got a quick soundbite from the two of them, but they both seem to agree that they know the deadline is looming, that they know they need to do something, and they need to have some sort of bipartisan agreement. What did we hear from them, and what do we know at this point about how negotiations are going?
Well, I thought the most interesting part was, that's me, right? Okay. I thought the most interesting part was at the end when the president was asked, is this now just a disagreement over spending levels? And he said, not that alone, which would suggest there are other issues that are either one or both sides are trying to tack onto this. We know, for example, that changes to permitting reform or approving major construction and infrastructure projects, energy projects, was something Republicans and Democrats wanted to raise. We heard the president say in his remarks with the speaker that they wanted to talk about taxes for the wealthy, which would at least be a way to generate some revenue to maybe offset the spending. And so it's unclear what else there might be there in the mix if he's saying that there are issues beyond the actual spending levels that are left to be negotiated. But as you said, as the speaker warned earlier today, this has got to come together now in the next maybe 36 hours or so if legislation is to be written, if it is to be passed in the House, given 3 days to matriculate per the speaker's caucus rules, then get passed, hopefully, then get sent to the Senate, where it has to go through procedural moves again, all before the June 1 deadline next week. And so we'll see now, coming out of this in the next hour or so, depending on how long they talk, whether or not they have a framework that they can send back to get written up and then get voted on.
Yeah, I mean, we have this June 1st deadline, but as you lay out there, what they need to do between now and then, there's not a lot of time to do it. Nicole, I know you were on Capitol Hill today talking to lawmakers as they were coming in and out of these negotiations. What was the sense that you were gathering from Capitol Hill? I mean, is a deal imminent?
Well, I don't know if imminent is the word because we continue to hear that there are significant differences. And we have also heard that things are at a very sensitive point right now because of this deadline. So I think, across the board, in talking to congressional leaders for weeks now, they have emphasized that default is not an option, but yet it's still not clear what that off-ramp will be. And again, when we're confronting this June 1st deadline, there have been some Republicans who have suggested that maybe that isn't such a hard deadline. And I did press the speaker on that as to whether or not he believes it's a firm date. Take a listen.
Do you think there's wiggle room on that June 1st date?
Look, that's up to Janet Yellen. That's probably, they decide when that date is. The president may have more information on that, but she's been very clear that June 1st, that's why we took action all the way back in April, even before she said it was June 1st. We thought it was in July. We don't want to be in this last moment. I think that's a terrible way to govern.
And And of course, since then, the Treasury Secretary has sent that letter to the Speaker warning that it is highly likely the Treasury will no longer be able to satisfy all of the government's obligations if Congress has not acted by early June, as early as June 1st. So that is still a very hard deadline and one that doesn't leave the Speaker or the President much time to reach an agreement.
Yeah, and Ed, to that note, I mean, what we heard from Yellen there is yet again another reminder, as you mentioned earlier, it's a way to kind of put pressure on this meeting as well, to remind McCarthy as well about this limit, this deadline. But can you kind of walk us through what the practical implications are? I mean, we talk a lot about all this negotiation back and forth. We know and have been talking about some of the sticking points. But what does it mean for everyday Americans who are watching this? What's at stake?
Well, one of the first indicators of the panic could come from the stock market, which today the NASDAQ closed up. The other indexes were down slightly, and it looked as if traders are just waiting and seeing like the rest of us about what exactly is going on here and whether they're getting closer to a deal. If not, you could start to see some real trouble with the stock market later this week. That, of course, starts to affect people's 401ks and their bottom line otherwise. There is concern that spending may get restricted. There are going to be potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people across the country who won't get government benefits or won't get paid if they're a government employee, because Secretary Yellen warning in her letter, now it's highly unlikely the Treasury will no longer be able to satisfy all of the government's obligations if Congress hasn't acted by June 1st. That means they might be able to keep the lights on to some respect, but they won't necessarily be able to make veterans payments, Social Security payments, pay the federal workforce, or make good on other obligations. And once the U.S. credit rating gets dinged like that, that has a ripple effect across the rest of the economy and around the rest of the world at a time when there are countries questioning this power of the dollar and whether the world economy really should be built around the American system. This might give fuel to that fire. But for people back home, again, if you're not getting paid, if your relatives aren't getting their benefits checks, you don't have necessarily the kind of purchasing power you would have had before. It could have a real effect on small businesses, on people's ability to get to work. And so, you know, that's a lot of the fear. The other issue, frankly, is just we've never been here before. So you can sort of game theory what exactly could transpire, but nobody really knows until it happens and until decisions have to be made on what exactly isn't being paid for by the federal government that could then ripple across the rest of the economy.
Yeah, and with that uncertainty and with so much at stake, Biden had returned from Japan over the weekend, cutting short his foreign trip to meet with leaders here. And Nicole, we actually now have some sound from Kevin McCarthy in the Oval Office. Let's take a listen.
I think at the end of the day, we could find common ground, make our economy stronger, take care of this debt, but more importantly, get this government moving again to curb inflation, make us less dependent upon China, and make our appropriation system work when we get done, right?
I'm all for making appropriations work. Now that I don't have to be there to do it.
Okay, so Nicole, some agreement about getting appropriations to get to work here. But from your conversations with McCarthy and members on Capitol Hill, what do you make of what he was saying there? I mean, it seems like he was laying out their side of the argument.
Yeah, well, what the Speaker has continued to insist and what he told me is that from February onward, he has been pressing the president not only to meet, but also, again, to rein in spending, that we have to spend less than we spent this year. And, you know, that's an interesting distinction to make, because he's also said we have to spend less than we spent last year, right? So if you keep in mind that Republicans passed their debt limit bill last month, where they basically want to cap spending at fiscal year 22 levels. The White House is proposing let's freeze spending at the current levels for fiscal year 23. So that's kind of one of those areas where there has been some negotiating back and forth. There's also the issue of work requirements. The Speaker continues to emphasize that that is very important to House Republicans. They want stricter work requirements for government assistance when it comes to things like SNAP, Medicaid. He did not necessarily say whether or not he wants additional cuts with respect to SNAP, which was something that emerged late as something that potentially Republicans may be seeking. But interesting, on the other side of the coin, even as the Speaker presses for less spending, he has been pressing, or Republicans have been pressing, for more defense spending in the upcoming fiscal year. Again, the Speaker not going into a lot of detail about the rationale and reason there, but again, that just gives you some insight into some of the distinctions and areas of disagreement between both of these sides.
All right, still quite a few sticking points, but they are sitting down, as we know, and we'll hear more about what comes out of that meeting, and we'll bring you the latest. Ed O'Keefe and Nicole Killian for now. Thank you very much for joining us. And as we said, lawmakers from both sides of the aisle are trying to get this resolution to the debt ceiling. We'll talk to Republican Congressman David Joyce, who joins us next. You're streaming America Decides.
I think people are of goodwill. I don't think there's any interest in us delaying these tough conversations. And so we want this to be productive. We want this to be a productive week.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was House Financial Services Committee Chairman Patrick McHenry on those debt limit negotiations. We're now less than 2 weeks away from the Treasury's default deadline. So for more on this, let's talk to Republican Congressman David Joyce, who joins us now from Capitol Hill. He represents Ohio's 14th District and is a member of the House Appropriations Committee. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for being here. So you heard Patrick McHenry here. Do you agree that both sides are working in good faith on this debt limit?
Yes, thanks for having me, Caitlin. I do believe that we are working in good faith, and we're trying to get to something that will have a consensus of, for certain, 218 Republicans, but also I think we'll be able to get something where even some Democrats might come over, and that's the way D.C. should work.
Congressman, you mentioned that. I mean, the idea of having Democrats on board, could you imagine a scenario in which Kevin McCarthy has to cut a deal that requires Democratic support, or do you think he needs something that gets the majority of Republicans?
Well, I think at the end of the day, you're trying to craft something that's the 218 Republicans will get on board with. But again, hopefully it's such a good bill that others will join as well and realize this is in the best interest of our country to put these requirements in place and to lift the debt ceiling and move forward.
I know you were supportive of Kevin McCarthy when he was running for Speaker. How would you assess how he's been navigating this challenge?
Yeah, Kevin's done a wonderful job as a Speaker to be able to sit down and put all variety of people with different viewpoints into a room and let the conversation go where it may, and building a consensus to try to get something that everybody can go back to their respectful groups and constituents and talk about what we're doing and why we're trying to do these things now and move the country forward. We can't continue on the road we're on with the spending. We have to start doing something about containing the spending, because while we're receiving record revenues, we're also continuing to spend at record rates. And the inflation at home has not been cured for anybody in my district.
Can we talk about some of the sticking points in this legislation? The House obviously passed a bill. Is there anything in there that you would be willing to give up for the sake of a broader negotiation?
Well, I think it's premature to talk about giving anything up because we're the only game in town. We passed the bill. The Senate's done nothing. And the president for 97 days has sat on his hands. And so we've talked about getting to this point. Everybody knew this was going to be a date set certain at some point. Treasury Secretary Yellen has moved that date up, obviously, to June 1st. But remember, before we passed this bill, it was mid-July. It was going to be August. Now it's moved up. Okay, so we stand ready, willing, and able to put together something that will serve the best interests of the people we represent. And we're waiting for the Senate and we're waiting for the president. But I think in this case, it's specifically the president to start talking realistic numbers with Kevin, the Speaker, so we could start putting together a bill that works.
And to that point about that House-passed bill, I mean, some Republicans, including those from the Freedom Caucus, are demanding that these debt ceiling negotiations pause until the Senate actually passes the Republican bill. I mean, that doesn't seem realistic. What do you say to them?
No, it's not realistic because, as we all know, the Senate is where good ideas and bills go to die. We're in a position where we put together something that is actually worthwhile, and we would hope that the Senator Schumer and his group would entertain it, but they haven't. But I think it's been focused from the get-go that these discussions are between the president and Speaker McCarthy, and that's what's going to take place in a few minutes, and hopefully become some realistic top-line numbers in which we can continue to appropriate and move the country forward.
And there's been some talk of using the 14th Amendment, bypassing Congress altogether. What would you make of that kind of scenario?
I don't think it's realistic at this point in time because obviously it would be subject to legal challenges. And as we all know, the market doesn't like legal challenges or uncertainty. The market likes certainty, and we need to keep the market focused on doing the things that they need to do instead of worrying about whether or not the 14th Amendment will be held to be constitutional and used in this manner. I think it's more important that as President Biden has been down this road before, as a senator and as a vice president, and now as a president. Ball's in his court. He knows that we're standing here ready, willing, and able to work. Let's start with realistic numbers and get moving.
Congressman, I want to switch gears a little bit because you are on the Ethics Committee. You are chairing a special referral, essentially, an investigation into George Santos. You voted to refer this Democratic-sponsored resolution that would want to expel Santos. That was referred to your committee. Some of your Republican colleagues voted present. Why did you vote the way that you did? And also, I know that you can't explain kind of the details of the investigation so far, but if you could give us kind of a wider parameters of where things stand in that committee.
Well, first off, I've always voted present when the vote has been about the subject matter in which the committee was going to be entertaining. In this case, if there was just a motion to expel, I'd have voted present for that too, because that would go to the subject matter. On this, it was, for whatever reason, a re-referral to the Ethics Committee, which is presently entertaining something, and we'll continue to do our job and let the Department of Justice do theirs.
And to that note, I mean, typically the Ethics Committee pauses on their investigations if the DOJ picks it up. That's not the case here. Can you explain why that is? Do you have more on your plate in terms of the scope of the investigation than the Justice Department does?
Well, the Justice Department in this case moved fairly quickly, but I will bet you that there'll be a superseding indictment at some point in the future, while they move forward on their case. But for our case, justice takes time. I didn't put any time limits on the investigation, and a bifurcated hearing in which DOJ will handle their matters and ethics will handle their matters that fall within their purview is consistent with what we've done all along. A lot of times the allegations of which DOJ would take it on would be purely criminal. And members have sat in session and been part of this. They've been stripped of their committees after they're indicted, but they've still been allowed to the due process of sitting here as a member until they're finally either plead guilty or found guilty, and then they're removed from Congress.
All right, we will keep an eye on that investigation as well as these debt limit negotiations. That one has a tighter deadline than yours does. Congressman David Joyce, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Caitlin.
And coming up, Senator Tim Scott's formal presidential campaign announcement also brought a key early endorsement. We're going to be taking a closer look at this crowded field of Republicans vying to take back the White House. We're streaming America Decides.
I'm announcing today that I'm running for President of the United States of America.
And that's South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, who officially is now running for president. He joins a crowded field of Republicans running for president, also a growing field, I should say, which may become even more crowded in the coming days. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins me now from North Charleston, South Carolina. Bob, good to see you out on the campaign trail. Obviously Donald Trump has been leading the field in poll after poll, but that doesn't appear to be deterring others from getting into the race. We see that with Scott today. I know you were at his campaign launch earlier today. What is his pitch? Where does he see himself fitting in this field?
Caitlin, you've covered Senator Scott as well as anyone in the country, and let's have a little conversation maybe. I mean, it seems like Senator Scott in his speech today was definitely positioning himself as a traditional conservative who has conservative views on issues like abortion, on the economy, but he's trying not to take that shot at former President Trump politically. He really wants to carve his own space in the Republican Party, but as you've covered, many challenges in the road ahead.
Yeah, Bob, it's really interesting that you say that because it seems like, he doesn't want to go after Trump directly, but it seems like the essence of his campaign is designed as a contrast to Trump, this kind of optimistic vision for the future, this positivity campaign, and not willing or wanting to really go after his rivals. Is that kind of how the campaign is fashioning itself, or do we expect the gloves to come off?
It's also interesting, Caitlin, that they're fashioning themselves as the quiet favorite of the Republican establishment. Let's listen to Senator John Thune of South Dakota, the #2 Senate Republican who showed up here in North Charleston earlier today.
I think people are anxious for a positive, hopeful, aspirational candidate. I hope there's a really wide lane for him out there, and I think he draws on the very best of the past. He's got a heritage that goes back to the kind of the Reagan years, but he also is somebody who's very much about the future, and you heard him talk about that today, and I think that's what the American people want to hear, and that is, what are you going to do for the future of this country, and restore that optimism, that hope, that positive voice that I think we've been lacking in our politics today.
So I was watching Senator Thune, Caitlin. He was in the rafters at the Scott event. Larry Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, was there. And behind Larry Ellison was former governor of South Carolina, Mark Sanford. They were all standing there, kind of their arms folded, listening to Senator Scott. And in him, they see someone who could be their standard bearer, someone who could represent the views of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the business community, social conservatives. But they're trying to see, does he have the energy, the momentum, the money to break through? For now, they're feeling pretty good, but it's a long road ahead.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear that call out of Larry Ellison. I mean, he is going to be donating a lot of money, already has, to Scott's endeavors. You had this conversation with Thune. I mean, this is just really important to point out that this is the #2 in leadership, as you mentioned. What else did Thune tell you, and what does it say about this endorsement? I mean, do we expect others to follow suit here, or is Thune kind of going out on his own? He's #2 to Mitch McConnell.
Leader McConnell is someone who has not pulled his punches when it comes to former President Trump. Senator Thune, someone who has a lot of friends in the Senate Republican Conference who are looking for an alternative to Trump. And they see in Senator Scott a colleague, but they also see an option. They want an option at this stage. And some of them are not totally comfortable with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is expected to get into the race later this week, at least in terms of filing his candidacy. They see in DeSantis the same kind of populism that turns them a bit off with former President Trump. And DeSantis, his battles with Disney have also not made him a favorite with many Senate Republicans. So Senator Scott harkens back to the Tea Party era, that more strident conservatism, fiscal conservatism that really speaks the language of so many who are in Congress and have been congressional Republicans for a long time.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Bob, to that point, too, that Scott's the only senator running. Usually Republicans try to run from outside Washington. He told us last month that he actually thinks it's an asset that he has, worked on deals and negotiations and legislation. So we'll see kind of how the public or the voters actually respond. But you mentioned DeSantis. We know that Trump has been eyeing DeSantis as his chief rival. He's obviously, as you mentioned, expected to get into the race later this week. But how has Trump been reacting to Scott's presidential bid?
He's been holding off. You saw his Truth Social post earlier today. He's not taking on Scott in any way. He's saying Scott's not a target. Scott's not a threat. He is the only senator running, as you noted. It's kind of interesting historically because most U.S. senators, having covered them for a long time, you and I have been there in the hallways, most of them look in the mirror every day and they seem to see a future president. And so it's often that a lot of senators jump in, a lot of governors jump in, just Senator Scott this time around. But we'll have to see how this plays out. Senator Scott is someone who has a lot of respect among power players in Washington, in New York, on Wall Street, but he's still not really known by the country. So that $15 million, $20 million from Larry Ellison, that's going to be really helpful in this initial spate of advertising to get Scott's name out there, to see if he can catch fire in Iowa, in New Hampshire.
And it looks like he is heading out on the campaign trail to Iowa and New Hampshire very soon as well. And I know you will be covering them all. Bob Costa, good to see you. Thank you so much for your reporting. And that does it for us today. You can stream America Decides Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.